The lecture that follows focuses on contemporary political parties and elections in Missouri. The lecture begins with a discussion of a fundamental truism in American politics, that we have a two-party system. Albeit briefly, I'd like to introduce this section by going back to a time when partisan divisions were not so clear, a time when parties in Missouri were more numerous and literally more colorful. The onset of the 1860s brought significant changes to the electoral landscape of both the nation and the state of Missouri. These changes and the consequent political turmoil were reflective of changing partisan alignments. The national parties were divided three ways: Whigs, Democrats, and Republicans. The Democrats were further divided between the Douglas and Breckinridge wings. Closer to home in Missouri, the Unionist Party was organized as a loose coalition of Republicans and former Democrats and Whigs. Depending on their views on emancipation, the Unionists were further divided between radicals and conservatives. Although both groups favored the Union, they differed over emancipation and the disenfranchisement of Confederates and Confederate sympathizers. Missouri historian, former Missouri State President, and all-around nice man, Dwayne Meyer, further divided the Unionists into charcoals, clay banks, chocolates, and snowflakes. While maintaining loyalty to the Union, the charcoals favored immediate emancipation. The clay banks proposed gradual emancipation, the chocolates were opposed to emancipation, and the snowflakes were more concerned about disenfranchisement and other legislation affecting whites. Has the Tea Party added color and uncertainty to American and Missouri politics? Sure, but it pales by comparison to the convulsive atmosphere of Missouri in the 1860s. Well, welcome back, everybody. Good to see you all here again today. We have been talking about participation. You know, our theme has been in many ways that Missouri is more democratic than other states because you, the citizen, get to participate in so many different ways. I want to take that discussion a little bit further and start talking about parties, start talking about elections and your participation with interest groups. But I want to start out this afternoon with a discussion with basically political parties. And I think we all know about political parties, but I want to start with something that maybe you don't know, and that's a term called alignments. And alignment is just really a fancy word for the line drawn between the two major political parties. Now, I know in history there have been more than two parties, but at least since the Civil War, we have had two parties in the United States, Democrats and Republicans. And we can save a discussion of why there are only two parties, what are the chances of a third party, and so on. We can save that for another class in another department somewhere else down the road. But let's just acknowledge that we have a two-party system. Move this chair out of the way. We have a two-party system. And that in any one period, and I'll identify three historical periods here in just a second, in any one period, there's a line that can separate the two parties. And that's what we call an alignment, the line between the two parties. Now, basically, there are three periods that we want to talk about, starting with the Civil War. And so I'm just going to go across here with the Civil War era, when the Democrats and Republicans really first came to the forefront as the two major parties. And basically the Civil War party alignment, or the line between the parties, was what would we call a sectional party system. Now, of course, when I say sectional party system in the Civil War, you immediately conclude North and South, and that's exactly right. The division between the Democrats and the Republicans was largely along sectional or regional lines between the North and South. But that party system, the sectional party system nationally, is reflected in Missouri as well. It is a sectional division, and you'll see the difference when we talk about the New Deal here in a second. But the division in Missouri is between Democrats and Republicans, as it is at the national level, and in Missouri, you will see Democrats basically in three places. You will see Democrats in the Boot Heel, Democrats in the eastern Ozarks, and in the area we call Little Dixie. Let me write this down here. So first of all, over in the Boot Heel, you'll find Democrats. In the eastern Ozarks, you'll find Democrats. And in the area that is referred to as Little Dixie. Now, we haven't used that term. It's not a term that's used very often, but it's counties that are centered right along the Missouri River. And if you're looking on the map, we're talking about Boone, Callaway, Audrain, Howard, Monroe, and Rawls County. They are north of the Missouri River and on the east side, kind of a little bit northwest of St. Louis. But those counties are referred to as Little Dixie because the immigrants for those counties came from the South. And they brought not just the South with them, but this is where the major crops were hemp and tobacco. People came from Tennessee, they came from Kentucky, and they came from Virginia, and they settled in this area that we refer to as Little Dixie. And it's Little Dixie because the original residents and settlers came from Big Dixie, the South. And more importantly, this is the area of Missouri where there was the most activity with respect to slavery. I mean, the tobacco plantations, they were prevalent in the South, and the slavery that went with them, that translated to Missouri in the Little Dixie area. So in terms of the sections that were Democratic of the state, the Boot Heel, the eastern Ozarks, and the area of Little Dixie. Now, the Republicans is also regional, and in one part not regional. We want to say immediately it'd be the western Ozarks, the Northwest Farm Belt, or Northwest Missouri, and then it's not geographic necessarily, without getting too carried away, German immigrants. If you came to Missouri from Germany, you're most likely to be a Republican. And so the Civil War split in the Democrats and the Republicans was sectional, North and South. The Civil War split between Democrats and Republicans in Missouri is also sectional with these two geographic divisions. All right, that's the alignment. Now, all things change with respect to Democrats and Republicans, and in many ways they flip, again for another class, but all the things change with respect to the New Deal. And so we have B would be the New Deal alignment. And what we would normally say would be realignment. And that's because the line that separates Democrats and Republicans actually changes. Now, there's a lot of debate in political science literature. Yeah, Joni says, don't go there. I won't. There's a lot of debate in terms of political science literature about what do we mean by alignments and de-alignments, but we're going to go, this is a 100-level class. All I'm going to say with respect to realignment is it's a new line. And you can think about it this way. If the old line was north and south, that's what separated the parties. The new line runs in a different direction. The new line that separates Democrats and Republicans is not geographic, it's not sectional, it is class-based. The New Deal alignment, or realignment, separates the two parties not by region, not by section, but by class. Now, this is pretty straightforward at the national level, so we'll spend a little bit more time at the Missouri. Basically, middle and upper middle class, the higher up you go, the more likely you are to be a Republican. Middle class and lower, the more likely you are to be a Democrat. And the class-based, it has income level, but also occupation, and we'll talk about that as we talk about with respect to Missouri. So the New Deal alignment is one that is class-based. It's fundamentally different than the Civil War alignment. Let's talk about how this is reflected in Missouri to try and be consistent. And do the same thing again. Where do you find Democrats in this new alignment, and where do you find Republicans? And so essentially we're going to do the same process here. In the Democrats, basically it's straightforward. You find Democrats in urban areas, urban Kansas City and urban St. Louis. And in terms of socioeconomic status and so on, we're going to see labor, working class, and minorities. So Democrats in Missouri are going to be found in the urban Kansas City, urban St. Louis area. No, John, I'm not saying that there aren't Democrats anyplace else. I mean, we're just talking about painting with broad strokes. Sure, there are Democrats in other parts of the states, but we'll talk about elections in a minute. If you want to win an election as a Democrat, you know, where should you be? Or what's the strategy that a Democrat needs to win an election? You're going to find the Democrats in the New Deal system. You're going to find them in urban Kansas City, the core urban areas of Kansas City, the core urban areas of St. Louis. All right, and so predominantly made up of labor and minorities. Now, Republicans, I could write every place else, because that's essentially the answer, because you'll find Republicans in suburban Kansas City, suburban St. Louis. So, you know, if we're talking about West County, you know, people say, students will say, yeah, I'm from St. Louis, but they're really not from St. Louis, they're from Chesterfield, they're from West County. And so there's a big difference between West County suburbs of St. Louis and South County, which is going to be more of the Democratic side. If you're going down towards Arnold, Fenton, and that sort of direction. But if you're going out to West County, then you're definitely be in Republican territory. So suburban Kansas City, suburban St. Louis, and what's referred to as outstate Missouri. Outstate Missouri means everything else. Outstate means not Kansas City, not St. Louis. As a rule, outstate includes Jefferson City, includes Springfield, Joplin, because more than likely you're going to find Republicans in outstate Missouri as well as the two suburban areas. And so the New Deal class-based system is reflected in Missouri, much like the Civil War sectional-based system was reflected in Missouri. And so these are the two big alignments in American party history, modern American party history, and there's been some tweaking, and I want to talk about the tweaking, but you have questions about the first two, Civil War, New Deal. All right, we've hinted at some of this before, so let's talk about the 80s and the 90s. Let's give this C, and let's talk about parties in the 80s and the 90s. Yeah, I'm going to make this 1980s instead of 1880s. Okay, if you insist, we'll make it C. Happy? Okay. 1980s, 1990s, we saw some changes in politics. We saw them nationally, but we have certainly talked about them in this classroom with respect to Missouri, and those changes have to do with social and more cultural issues. The 80s and the 90s saw the rise of more politically relevant social and cultural issues. Now, give me an example. What starts to percolate in Missouri? What's the important political issue in Missouri, John? Abortion. We talked about abortion. Janice wants to, gay marriage. You know, these are the kinds of issues. And we've talked about there's some tension within the Republican Party over these, but there's tension in the Democratic Party as well. And the argument was being made that these social and cultural issues were going to be a new line, a realignment, changing that New Deal alignment, drawing a new line around the basis of these social and cultural issues. But ultimately, excuse me, the New Deal alignment, this is important, so go ahead and write it down. Ultimately, the New Deal alignment still holds in Missouri. The New Deal alignment still holds in Missouri. What about these social issues? I will say that they have weakened the New Deal. These social issues that have come up, abortion, gay rights, right to die, those things that we've talked about, they have weakened the bonds that held Republicans and Democrats together. Democrats have had to make choices over these social issues. Republicans have had to make choices over these social issues. But ultimately, when it comes to voting in November, this New Deal class-based party system still survives. So this is important. Weakened in the 80s and 90s. Definitely the New Deal bonds have been weakened, but it's not a realignment. That New Deal alignment still holds. And I would add, even though it's still early, I mean, you want to get through a decade and then watch it for another 10 years to see, but I think I would add, what about the 2000s? You know, we've all lived through this next period. Well, that would be the 200s. So what about since 2000? What about 2000 to 2010? What about 2010 to 2020? What do we see in Missouri politics? What do we see in national politics? Well, I think what you see here is, again, no change in the alignment. No change in the alignment. That means that Missouri's Democrats and Republicans are still divided in a New Deal class-based system. So, again, worth writing down. Still New Deal class-based system. Now, that being said, let's talk about demographics, because I really think the issue is not a realignment, but it's a change in the nature of the Missouri's population. And so when we talk about the population of the state, we're talking about demographics. And I can think of no better way than to talk about the 3rd Congressional District, which is South St. Louis, the 3rd U.S. Congressional District. And bear with me, because in the end, you're going to say, oh, that was worth talking about. All right, 3rd Congressional District. In your lifetime, the 3rd Congressional District was held by a congressman named Dick Gebhardt. We don't have time to talk about Dick Gebhardt, but Dick Gebhardt held the 3rd Congressional District until 2005. He had been elected 13 times. Dick Gebhardt held the 3rd Congressional District as a Democrat, and he had been elected 13 times, 26 years. He succeeded a 12-term incumbent, a Democrat for 12 terms, which is 24 years, and that was Leonore Sullivan. Coincidentally, she was the first woman elected to represent Missouri, but that is a seat, 13 elections, 12 elections for the predecessor. There is not a better example of a solidly Democratic congressional district than Missouri's 3rd. Dick Gebhardt personifies the solid base for the Democratic Party in the state of Missouri. And this is a district, again, 13 times succeeding someone who got elected 12 times. You can't get more Democratic than that. So let's fast forward to 2010. In 2010, United States Congressman Russ Carnahan, I'm sorry, Carlos? Yes, Russ Carnahan is the son of former Governor Carnahan. He's the son. Russ Carnahan was elected to succeed Congressman Gebhardt. When Congressman Gebhardt retired from the House, Russ Carnahan ran for that seat and was elected. In 2010, Russ Carnahan was challenged by a Republican, Ed Martin. Now, what I want you to think about is what's happened between 2005 and 2010. In the 2010 election, Russ Carnahan wins. It's still a Democratic district, but he wins by a margin of 49% to 47%. All right, something has happened in the 3rd Congressional District for a district to be so solidly Democratic to come down to the wire. I mean, this is decided at 1 o'clock in the morning with potential challenges down the road, 47% to 49%. What happened? Well, what happened is that class base, the working class labor and the minority population in that district is declining. It's an issue of demographics. What was a solidly Democratic district in 2010 looks winnable for the Republicans. Now, what happened next? Well, what happened next is Missouri's population went down relative to the other states, according to the census, and the legislature had to get rid of a congressional district. Which congressional district did they get rid of? The 3rd congressional district. The 3rd congressional district is eliminated. And it's eliminated in the legislature over the veto of Governor Nixon, but the legislature overrides the veto with the help of Democratic legislators. Democrats saw the 3rd district as less winnable. They would have to spend more money to keep it than to just simply let it go. This is a dramatic change in demographics. The 3rd district is a great description of what has happened in the state overall. The difference between the two parties is still class-based. It's still New Deal. The issue for the Democrats is magnified here by the 3rd congressional districts. The demographics, the number, the core of Democratic support is declining. With me? All right. Now, we spent a lot of time, maybe an inordinate amount of time, on alignments because ultimately, and I have to say this as a political scientist, ultimately there's probably less of a difference between the two political parties than people make out. So I want to talk about the two different kinds of parties and how we see that in Missouri. So let me erase, and we'll start talking about the two different kinds of parties. Okay. Two kinds of political parties. They are ideological parties and pragmatic parties. Ideological parties or pragmatic. Now, in English, ideological parties are going to be defined by principle. And I'll give you some points here in just a second. Ideological parties are those defined by principle. Pragmatic parties are parties defined by election. Now, sometimes pragmatic is self-explanatory, but just in case it's not, we'll come back to that. But let me tell you about ideological parties, which we probably need to talk more about. I want you to think about two things with respect to ideological parties. The first is the party and its members have a common set of public policy positions. Common set of positions. In a nutshell, everybody in the party believes the same thing. It's a common set of principles. And the second thing is equally as important, that the party presents a clear alternative to the other party. In short, ideological parties stand for something. They believe in something, they run for re-election on those things, and they enact those policies when they get elected. That's a party defined ideologically or a party defined by principle. The opposite kind of party is a pragmatic party, which is defined by election, which is not defined by principle. That's the easiest way. It's not defined by principle. It's defined by winners and losers. And I'll explain this as we go. But a pragmatic party is defined by winners and losers. And ultimately, the party itself doesn't stand for something. The party, the name, is simply a label. You go by this name. You go by this label. But that label doesn't actually tell you what people believe in. Maybe I can make this a little bit clearer as we go. Two kinds of parties, ideological and pragmatic. Well, Let's explain pragmatic a little bit more. Let's talk about conventional wisdom. I know conventional wisdom is usually wrong, but it's a 100 level class and it's easier to talk about this. Okay. What is that? George, that is correct. It is a bell curve, but we say bell curve in high school. What do we call it in college? Joni? That is correct. This is a normal distribution. This is a normal distribution. Where are most of the people? Most of the people are in the middle. This is a normal distribution. And if you understand normal distribution, not that you have to take statistics, you don't have to have SOS 302 or Psych 200, but if you just understand the basic notion of a bell curve, then you'll understand pragmatic parties a little bit better. Okay, a normal distribution. Number one. The second thing I want you to think about is winner take all. Two concepts, normal distribution, winner take all, that'll help you understand pragmatic parties. Winner take all means just what it says, winner takes all. So, Carlos, I want you to run for re-election. I want you to run for election. Do you want to be a Democrat or you want to be a Republican? All right, Carlos wants to be a Republican. Here's my normal distribution, Carlos. Where do you want to be? All right, you want to be on the right. How far on the right do you want to be? Okay. Here? Okay. Now, who would like to challenge Carlos? No, Janice. Okay, Janice is going to challenge Carlos. You're going to have to run as a Democrat because he's already, unless you want to challenge him in the primary, but that's another class. All right, Janice, where do you want to be? Okay, about the same. All right, Janice wants to be over here. All right, fair enough. Republican on the right, Democrat on the left. But they're both wrong. John, where do you want to be? No, I don't care whether Democrat or Republican. Where do you want to be? You're going to run for office. Where do you want to be? John wants to be in the middle. John, why do you want to be in the middle? Because that's where the most voters are. That's where the most voters are. Now, John, you want to be a Democrat or Republican? Okay, John wants to be a Republican, but he's going to be a Republican in the middle. So that leaves George. You want to be the Democrat? Okay, where do you want to be? No, don't think too hard, George. It's a 100 level class. I want you to think about Robin Hood. What happens in every single Robin Hood movie? Every single Robin Hood movie. The King's Archer comes out, he pulls back the bow and he gets a bullseye. And everybody claps, claps, claps. Nobody can beat that shot. What does Robin Hood do? Robin Hood splits that arrow. And George, that's what you want to do. Democrats and Republicans are vying for where the most voters are. Parties in the United States and parties in Missouri are defined by pragmatism because we have a system that is called winner take all. Carlos and Janice, you move this way, you lose voters. You move this way, you lose voters. The best candidate is the one who can figure out where the middle is. And so it's better to figure out where the middle is than to stand firmly on principle, because we have winner take all. If you want to be ideological, if you want to stand on principle, you are going to lose, because that's not where the voters are. So ultimately, in the United States and in Missouri, parties are defined by pragmatism. With me so far? Now, it's important to recognize, what color is Missouri? Let's go all the way back to the beginning, all right? Missouri is a red state. So that means Missouri's middle is more conservative than another state. And we'll talk about this as it applies to elections in just a second. So in a federal system, it's important to recognize that the middle in Missouri is not the same as the middle in Illinois or Massachusetts or Texas or Alaska. Each state has its own identifiable middle. And we'll talk about that as it applies to elections here as we go. So, two kinds of parties: ideological, stand on principle, or pragmatic. In Missouri, it's pragmatism. In Missouri, it's pragmatism. Yes, I can give you an example. One of my favorite former senators, Senator Frank Barnett, a state senator from the Rolla area. Pro-life, pro-gun, pro-everything that a good Republican should be, except he was a Democrat. Because his constituents were conservative, his constituents were pro-life, his constituents were pro-gun, he was pro-life and pro-gun and got elected as a Democrat. Joni? No, he's not pandering. He's not moving his position to where the voter is. He is one of them. He is pro-life. He is pro-choice. I'm sorry, he is pro-life. He is pro-gun. He is just like them. He runs under the label of the Democrat. There's a lot of reasons. Again, we don't have time to do that. But Senator Frank Barnett, in any other state, in other parts of the state of Missouri, might be a Republican, but he was elected as a Democrat. So keep that in mind. All right, let's take this and apply it to elections statewide. So, riddle me this, Batman, if you want to do the Batman and Joker thing. If Missouri parties are pragmatic, if the most votes are in the middle, and if Missouri is a conservative state, how does a Democrat get elected statewide? Now, be careful. I said, how does a Democrat get elected statewide? I don't want to get down to how does a Democrat get elected in Springfield or how does a Democrat get elected in St. Louis or Kansas City. I just want to talk about big picture, statewide level. How does a Democrat get elected statewide? By not being too liberal. Or, more importantly, by not being perceived as too liberal. I mean, there's what the campaign makes of you versus what you actually are. And I'll give you an example here in just a second. So I think there's two things, or there's one, I mean, those are the two things. How do you get elected statewide as a Democrat? It's by not being too liberal, or at the very least, by not being perceived as too liberal, because Missouri is a conservative state. Let me give you some examples. Let's talk about Governor Nixon, Governor Holden, and Governor Carnahan. All elected statewide as governor, of course, all elected as Democrats. Now, let's contrast that to Harriet Woods and Jay Nixon, squared. Harriet Woods ran for the United States Senate, statewide as a Democrat. Jay Nixon ran for the United States Senate twice as a Democrat. What's the difference between Nixon, Holden, and Carnahan, Harriet Woods, and Jay Nixon squared? Well, it's the difference between winners and losers. It's a difference between winners and losers because Governor Nixon, Governor Carnahan, Governor Holden were perceived to be not as liberal as one might suspect from a Democrat, but more importantly, it's the difference between the candidates. You know, my liberalism versus your conservatism. Governor Jay Nixon is not considered a wild-eyed liberal. He is a conservative Democrat by most measures. Harriet Woods and Jay Nixon running for Senate were perceived to be too liberal, or more accurately, more liberal than their more conservative opponents. And so it's important to look at this issue. How does a Democrat get elected statewide? Because we elect Democrats regularly, but we don't elect the same kind of Democrat that they would elect next door in Illinois. Because Missouri is a conservative state, when Missouri elects Democrats, they tend to elect more conservative Democrats. Now, let's talk about geography a little bit. Let's amplify this a little bit more right here. Cities plus. What that means is Governor Nixon, Governor Holden, Governor Carnahan won the solid core Democratic areas and the urban areas in St. Louis and Kansas City, plus votes in outstate Missouri. The losing candidates, Harriet Woods, Jay Nixon, or go back to Congressman Alan Wheat, cities only. And I have a better example of this in just a second. But when it comes right down to it, the Democrat statewide can't be successful if they only appeal to the Democratic core in Kansas City and St. Louis. In order to win statewide, they have to get some support in outstate Missouri. The difference between winners and losers, perceived to be less liberal or more conservative, perceived to be too liberal, is in part then related to winning the cities plus some outstate rural areas and winning in only the core areas. Now, let's talk about one most recent example, Robin Carnahan. In 2010, Robin Carnahan, who was Secretary of State, ran against then Congressman Roy Blunt for the United States Senate. Robin Carnahan lost. Robin Carnahan was perceived to be too liberal. One key incident in Robin Carnahan's campaign, and this illustrates the dilemma for Democrats. I call it the photo op. President Obama came to Kansas City, and the question was, would Robin Carnahan appear on stage with President Obama? Now, President Obama is popular with Democrats in Kansas City. And so it's in your best interest, if you want to win the Democratic core in Kansas City, it's in your best interest to appear with President Obama. On the other hand, statewide, President Obama is not popular. Missouri went for John McCain, which we'll talk about later, but President Obama is not popular, so when you appear with President Obama, you instantly become the target for the too liberal tag. And that's exactly what happened. Robin Carnahan had to choose. She chose to appear on stage with President Obama, and the Republicans basically had a field day. Tied her to President Obama and his policies, and Robin Carnahan lost statewide because she was perceived to be too liberal. And again, I'm not saying that Democrats can't win statewide. I'm not saying that at all, but relative to your opponent, it's that perception of liberalism and conservatism. All right, so winners and losers, ideology is in part, what areas you carry is in part. But I don't want to make it just about numbers. It's not just about numbers and ideology. I do think that campaigns and candidates matter. So let me come over here and we'll finish up with the past and the very near future, because I do think candidates and campaigns matter. So let me write that here. I think candidates and campaigns do matter. And I want to use Senator Claire McCaskill, Democratic Senator Claire McCaskill, as an example. And this example is going to last forever because it's such a darn good one. Senator Claire McCaskill ran for governor in 2004. All right, the 2004 gubernatorial election. Claire McCaskill had challenged Governor Holden in the primary, and she won the chance in the Democrats to challenge the Republican, and that was Matt Blunt. Now, we know Matt Blunt ended up winning, so Governor Blunt. But I want to talk about the numbers so that you get a sense of what I mean by campaigns make a difference. Matt Blunt won 51% to 48%. By any stretch of the imagination, this was a nail-biter. This was a close election, went right down to the wire. In terms of counties, and I won't bore you with which ones, McCaskill won 13 counties in Missouri, but she lost the election. So she carried 13, but lost the election. She carried the urban areas, but not enough of the outstate areas to win. Undaunted, Claire McCaskill ran again statewide against Senator Talent. So 2006, we have, within just 2 years, we have another race with Claire McCaskill. Now, 2 years, nothing has changed. The state is the state. The political scene is not significantly different in 2006 than it was in 2004, but the election result was different. In 2006, Talent gets 47, and McCaskill gets 50%. Again, don't get me wrong, a very, very close election. But what was the difference? The difference is Claire McCaskill won 18 counties this time. 5 more counties, and all of them rural or outstate counties. Claire McCaskill was able to keep the Democratic core in Kansas City and St. Louis and then get more votes in outstate Missouri. So 5 more counties, a total of 18 counties. That was enough to basically flip the results of that election. Now, getting back to ideology, Claire McCaskill actually won 10 more counties than President Obama. What is, Carlos says, just get that, huh? All right, 5 more than last time for a total of 18, but those 18 were 10 more than President Obama. President Obama is perceived to be too liberal for the state of Missouri. The state of Missouri voted for John McCain. But Claire McCaskill was able to convince those voters in those 18 counties that she was not too liberal. So the voter in Missouri is perceptive. The voter in Missouri can see where you are on that ideological scale. And so the difference between 2004 and 2006, statewide, isn't significant. The difference is in the campaign of Claire McCaskill, convincing more outstate voters that she was the right person for the job. And so ultimately, what it comes down to is a shrinking Democratic base. A growing ideological conservatism makes it harder for Democrats to win statewide. Now, again, as I said, I'm not talking about a Democrat running for city council in Springfield. I'm not talking about Democrats running for state rep or state senate in Kansas City and St. Louis or any place else. Statewide, big picture, broad strokes. Missouri's parties are pragmatic. You know, you want to be as close to the middle as possible. But ultimately, the core issue for Democrats is that shrinking base. All right, parties and elections, all in a short period of time. Questions? Okay, thank you very much. Next time, we'll talk about interest groups and how you participate that way. Thank you.